Welcome. This is Matt Leighninger from the Deliberative Democracy Consortium. Thank you for logging in and calling in to today's webinar, which is about walking through the CCS Toolkit, walking through the different materials, including the discussion guide, information brief, and planning guide that are now available and have been available on the Creating Community Solutions website. I'm going to be doing some of the presenting here today. And also I'll be joined by Tom Campbell, who's going to introduce himself in a second. Tom and I work together to write some of the materials here, the information brief and the guide. And Tom also has subsequently used the materials and created new materials to go along with them at the LEAD site in Sacramento in July. So he can give us, he's going to be giving us some of his stories from the field. So first, let me walk through the agenda here. We're going to do some introductions in a second. Then I'll say a little bit more about the National Dialogue on Mental Health and give you some of the kind of broader context and to take a look at the website. And then, of course, most of the time we're going to spend in the third bullet here, which is going session by session through the information brief and the discussion guide and talk about kind of the goals of each one, the types of information that are presented, the types of discussion questions that you'll see, and some of the adaptations that you might want to consider as you're putting in local information or asking questions that are more pertinent to your community or some of those kinds of things. And then we'll spend a little bit time at the end on the planning guide. That will get short shrift, I think, compared to the other two pieces of the toolkit, because we've actually had several other websites which are really focused on the organizing of these events. We will definitely answer questions people have about the organizing to the extent that we have time, but there are other webinars and that there's some other resources we can point you to for more information about the organizing. So let me say a little bit about how the webinar will work. First of all, our Wizard of Oz behind the curtain here is Raquel Goodrich, who you may know. She's been working on Creating Community Solutions for most of the year. She's at the National Institute for Civil Discourse based in Arizona. And so Raquel is the one who's clicking the slides along and managing all of the different technical and logistical aspects of the webinar. There are a couple of different features that we'll be using. One, we'll ask a couple questions of you. We'll do a quick poll here, mainly to get a sense of where you are as far as what your kind of why you came to this webinar, and then what your level of experience is with these kinds of public engagement processes. Then we will have a couple different ways in which you can ask questions. You're muted right now, but you won't be the whole time if you don't want to be. And so there's two ways you can ask questions. One, you can simply type them into the chat window that you'll see there on the right-hand side of your screen, and Raquel will read off those questions at some point in the webinar, depending on when she sees them being kind of relevant to what we're talking about. Or if you want to be heard and you want to kind of break into the conversation right now, you can simply raise your hand, and you'll see that there's a button for that at the top right as well. So that way, when you raise your hand, Raquel will see it, and she will interrupt us, and we'll get you into the conversation. Once we're done with the slides here, obviously we'll be throwing it open to any questions or comments people have, and you can be raising hands and also typing whatever you want to do. So let's go on to the next piece. So I'm Matt Leininger, as I said. The Deliberative Democracy Consortium is an alliance of nonprofits and academic researchers who are all practicing, studying, advocating for public participation and deliberative democracy. And this project has been really exciting to work on because it's one of the only ones that I know of, particularly in this country, that is a national scale type of deliberative process where we have people all over the country talking about the same issue in the same sort of way, generating data, generating action ideas in this kind of large way, which is connected then to action at the local level. So Tom, can you say more about yourself?
Sure, I'm Tom Campbell, and I'm a senior associate with AmericaSpeaks, and I've been working on public engagement projects for about 15 years with AmericaSpeaks, and this has been a very exciting project for us because of the connection with all the different groups doing work on it as well, and the timeliness of it. So I'm in D.C. currently. We're setting up for another project on October 12th, and with the Navy Yard incident just happening, and mental health conversations here are really pretty critical, and so it's very timely, and I'm glad that we can start sharing more of our practical experience in the field.
Awesome. Thank you for joining us. And next we have a couple of poll questions. And the first one basically asks, what brings you to this webinar? And we were just curious to know, are you, organizing a CCS event? Actually, some of you may have already done that event. There are a few red pins on the map, so I suppose some of you may already be coming back with some experience here. Or are you considering hosting an event? You're considering hosting an event. Are you interested in finding an event to participate in? Are you a researcher trying to kind of study the effects of some of these processes, or other? And if you click other, you can also type your response in the little chat window, and Raquel may at some point let us know the types of things that people typed. So if you click one of those options, we really should have the Jeopardy music playing here, but we just have to wait a second until it all gets totaled up. Looks like it's loading up. There, okay. So yes, we have the majority of the people who are in fact organizing the event, a quarter of people considering whether to do so, a few participants or potential participants, no researchers, gosh, why not? And some people who clicked other. Then we have one other question here. Raquel, did you want to, was that you?
Yeah, I was just going to say I didn't get any responses in the chat window for what was meant by other, but Michelle Holt-Shannon did say that now Jeopardy music is playing in her head.
Oh, good. All right. Excellent. So we have one other question, which is, let's see, pop up here. Yeah, so this is more about your level of experience. Some of you may have done this type of work, organizing these large-scale events, organizing around a particular issue, deliberatively getting people a chance to talk about different options or views. Some of you may have facilitated those types of events or similar kinds of dialogues where people are talking about some kind of public issue. And others of you may actually have written discussion guides or information briefs like the ones that we're going to be talking about today. So just curious about people's experience. And of course you can click, yes, right, this is one where you can click all that apply. So if you've done all three of these things, you click all three. Now we just need to be able to type in Michelle's Jeopardy music from New Hampshire into our into our webinar. Okay, so everybody on this call has facilitated a small group dialogue on one time or another. A third of you, wow, that's great, have written these kinds of guides and info briefs before, and also a fairly substantial number of you have actually organized them as well. So as always, I mean, you all bring a lot of expertise to this. So in addition to whatever questions you have that you want to type in or raise your hand about, please feel free also to give comments or suggestions or things that you are doing to add to the materials in your community or other things that you want to do that you think other people on the webinar might benefit from.
And in response to the previous question, Tim Boneman typed in that he is a technology provider, so we do have someone from that aspect as well.
Good. Actually, we should have thought about, but that should have been one of the options in our poll there.
Yeah.
Because there's plenty of ways in which, in fact, Tim, I'm sure you should suggest some, but there are plenty of ways in which to use online tools as part of this process of either formulating discussion guides or getting them used outside face-to-face meetings and so on and so forth. So let me say a little bit about the National Dialogue on Mental Health. And if you would, if you can, if you're at a computer, it would be great if you just actually went to the website, because you'll get the latest version of our map, our constantly shifting map. If you go to creatingcommunitysolutions.org, you will see it, and you'll see that we've got about, gosh, I think it's about 75 pins right now. And the pins are in various shades. When you see green or kind of blue-green pins, those are ones that are events being planned. The red ones are upcoming. That means they've got an actual date. That the planning is well underway, and people have decided we're going to hold this event on such date. And then the yellow ones are the pins for things that have already happened. So a couple of the pins are lead sites, meaning that they were large-scale events where you had about 300 people or so, a very diverse kind of cross-section of the community who took part in one of these processes. And of course, Tom's going to be talking about the one in Sacramento that he organized and the materials that he adapted for that one. Also, Albuquerque is another one of the lead sites. You see that yellow pin there. And a couple of the bigger, the lead sites that are coming up are the ones in greater Kansas City and in Washington, D.C. Those are coming up in the next few weeks. So a couple other things to know about this. One is, if you haven't already, and I hope you have, there's the resources tab up there at the top of the page. You can click on that and you can download the different guides we'll be talking about, the content of the webinars. You can view them again if you need them, and a bunch of other resources. There will be a quick start guide that we'll be talking about a little bit later on the call that will be there on Monday, and a bunch of other things as well. You can also access the online Civic Commons discussions through the website. And then the other thing to know is that Sue McCormick, our community liaison who started about a month or so ago, is a terrific resource. If you haven't already talked to her, please do. She's very experienced. She's done these kinds of things before, not only organizing them herself and also helping other people do it. And so she's a great person to talk to about to find other allies in your community, to find other resources, to just get general kind of tips and suggestions about what you're doing. I find that's always very helpful to have somebody like that to talk to. So please do reach out to Sue and to tell her what you're doing and how she can be helpful to you. So now if we can go on to, yes, the 4 discussion sessions. So this is basically the skeleton of this process reflected in the info brief and the discussion guide. And we're going to talk in turn about each one of these, kind of the goals of each session, and what materials are already available in these guides. So with the first session, it's getting people to talk about what mental health means to them and their community. The second session gets people talking about key factors and challenges that influence mental health, and at that point, a lot of the data really becomes even more crucial. The third session really focuses more on young people in particular, and it begins to shift people into more of an action conversation about what kinds of things do we want to see happening here, what kinds of pieces will we be adding into a plan in our community, and then the last session, what are the action steps that we want to take, and specifically what might people really be willing to do. And of course, you're all, it sounds like most of you are quite familiar with this kind of stuff, and you recognize this typical progression here from personal experience to viewpoints and options to action. So in the first session, in the info brief, what you've got is a fair amount of overview kind of material about the continuum of mental health, cultural differences about it, attitudes and beliefs, some examples of challenges, some kind of overview of treatment, access, treatment gaps, treatment processes, some material on young people, and community impacts. There's a lot of information here, and just so that you know, I mean, one thing that Tom and I did when we were writing these materials was sift through an enormous amount of data that was, most of which was sent to us from our partners at SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. And so if you think there's a lot of facts and figures in the info brief now, you haven't seen any. There was about 20 times that much stuff that we had to kind of go through and to figure out what is the most important thing, what will be the most useful facts and figures for this conversation. So that's what's in the info brief for session 1. And then in the discussion guide, what you've got, again, these are kind of typical features of a deliberative guide. One, you've got a process for setting ground rules and giving people a chance to kind of decide how they're going to behave in the course of the session. You've got some discussion questions, which are probably the most important in the whole guide, that get people talking about their experiences and kind of connecting them to what they believe about the issue, and then getting a little bit more focused on kind of why is mental health important to our schools, to our community, and having people talk about the things that they care about that brought them to the conversation. So, Tom,
I'd love to.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'd be happy to share some of my experience in taking this broad information brief, which does have a lot of information and is full of lots of text, and being able to translate that into a fairly direct conversation. And obviously, the opening conversation is where people can start to share some of their experiences. You don't want to drown people in text in this. And for each of these sessions, and they are on the resources page as well as the page on Sacramento, I produced a 2 to 3 page discussion guide, which is really also in PowerPoint as well, and those are on the Sacramento place as well, so that we digested the information brief into about a 10-minute presentation, which gives people really this overview of mental health, how there's a continuum between mental health and mental illness. We look at the prevalence of mental health and illness, and look at some of the questions that people raise, and just getting everybody sort of a baseline about the conversation, because it can be a more complicated conversation. It's obviously very personal, so being able to set sort of a broad base of understanding about it is important, because oftentimes the language we use is very difficult for some people, especially when it gets into things like what are some of the disorders. In the information brief, it talks about disorders. We actually, in the slide that I did and in the discussion guide, moved that more towards signs and symptoms and didn't necessarily focus on mental illness and disorders, because we felt like it was an easier way for people to get into it, especially in the conversations that I've been doing in Sacramento. We had, out of 300 people, we had nearly 100 youth in the room. So being able to make this so it's accessible, not so much into kind of language that many people don't easily recognize and have to read the definition. So our goal in session 1 is to give people a common point to start a conversation, starting with their own kind of experiences, and then moving toward how important is mental health to me and to our community.
And can you say, Tom, also just about the kind of the logistics of the day? So here we have, at Sacramento, we had a situation where we had, all the people in the same room at the same time at in small groups at tables. But for each of those sessions, right, you had the slides that you're referring to, kind of an additional presentation, which basically kind of boiled down for them the key things from the info brief and the key questions you wanted them to ask. Can you say more about that, how that worked, and kind of what times did you give to each piece and all that kind of thing?
Sure, absolutely. I think what is interesting about others looking at the materials we've already developed is that it can be used for a small conversation of 7 or 8 people all the way to 300 to 1,000. And so the basis of work that we do is on basically a round table. And so we have a trained facilitator at every table. And the presentation, maybe the review of the discussion guide takes about, we give a presentation that takes about 10 minutes. Then we ask people to take a look at the material in the discussion guide, a 2 to 3 pager, reflecting on that. We also use a worksheet. So we give somebody a worksheet for question 1, discussion 1, so that they can write down some of their thoughts before they start a conversation. That, I think, really is beneficial for people to not just somebody launching into, well, I had this experience, and it goes really deep. And obviously, with mental health, it does touch some very deep, personal, and complicated, difficult issues. So the way in which we organized it was to have about a little presentation, review the discussion guide, and then about 30 minutes of conversation, reflecting a little bit just initially around the table on your personal experiences and how that shaped your attitudes and beliefs about mental health. And then secondly, which is to start extending this question toward the community. And while you've had these personal and family experiences, what does that mean to the community? We've kind of left community broad, so it can be your own, how you kind of your extended family, or to your neighborhood, to your city. So I think it provides a nice opening process to enter this conversation. And you can certainly not have to go through all the other 3 discussion guides. You could just even do the simple discussion on discussion one.
Yep. Great. So please do, everybody, either raise your hand or type in questions. Like if you have a question on session 1, for example, or please type it in now or raise your hand. But meanwhile, I guess we will move on to session 2, which again we have a kind of a whole set of materials of information in the brief about, again, this time kind of key factors and challenges, and it's getting, at this point, getting into kind of a little bit more of a deliberative mode in the conversation where people are trying to decide, which of these is most prevalent in my community, which of these factors seems like it's most important as far as kind of understanding how people are dealing with mental health here, particularly kids. And so it's got information, as you see, about all these different kinds of things, including the kind of how mental health affects and different kind of populations in the community. There's a section here about sexual orientation. There's material here about kind of how people pay for health care, access to support and treatment, and some particular stuff here about kind of people who are young adults transitioning to adulthood. Then in the discussion side of things, generally what you're doing here is trying to get people to kind of to grapple with the data. And so one thing you have is a couple of discussion questions which direct people to the information brief and have them kind of try to absorb some of this material. And that actually, of course, is one of the biggest time variables, because of course it is a lot of information to absorb. And so if you're not in the situation where you've got everybody in the same room and doing the kind of slide-based process or slide-enabled process that Tom's describing, the question here is, is there enough time? Are you building enough time for people to actually look at the material? Are they going to be able to have access to the info brief before the session? All those kinds of things. In this session 2, there's a kind of a piece that really focuses on young people's perspectives, in particular, finding out also what is in place already, what kinds of programs and supports there are available for people through the school system, through higher ed, through other kinds of programs and projects in the community, and then understanding some of the key challenges.
This is another session. Yeah, this is another session. And Raquel, if we could go back to the previous one that kind of gave the list of the key factors and challenges here. So when you look at the information brief, there's a lot of information scattered in different places. And so when this session 2 is about what are some of those key factors and challenges that prevent us from making progress on mental health, I took some of the elements from in the information brief and shifted them into key factors and challenges. And the discussion guides that are on the Sacramento site and in the resources section, you'll see how I group this. And now I'm doing a focus group tonight, I'm even looking at this a little bit more simply, because when you have a list of 10 or so factors here, it gets kind of complicated and it's hard to sort of understand all these different things. They seem fairly disjointed. So in my next group tonight, I'm going to group these a little bit differently. So one is to kind of take sort of the broader economic poverty, homelessness, criminal justice issues and say these are some of the broad relationships that exist. When somebody is in poverty, they're much more likely to have mental health issues of when people in the criminal justice system, if you're homeless. All of those are certainly very correlated to challenges that we have to work on. Secondly, I'm grouping the next group into sort of attitudes and beliefs, and in that one I look at discrimination and stigma, cultural influences, sexual orientation, and I think I put bullying in that one as well. And then the third is more some of the serious mental conditions that we find, suicide, depression, substance abuse, and some of the various disorders that are very difficult to treat generally. So this whole process continues to evolve as we look at the conversation, and what we've done in the presentation here is take a look at some of these key factors and challenges. What are those that really you think are very significant to you and to your community? And looking a little bit from the youth perspective, one of the things that we did in Sacramento is when we voted, we use keypad voting, so we can distinguish between what youth believe and what older adults believe. So I kind of compared youth, which we've defined as up to age 24, with 25 and older. And while some of the older folks felt like stigma was more important, the youth felt they had a more relationship and concern about bullying and the effect of bullying and sort of digital disrespect. So it's interesting to see what youth believe and what service providers and others in the field believe about some of these key factors and challenges.
Great. Okay, so session 3 moves us on here to kind of more of an explicit focus on young people and more of a kind of an action-oriented sort of discussion. In the info brief, you've got kind of a lot of material which is focused on young people in particular, and kind of describes some of how mental health affects them in particular. In the discussion itself, if you look at the guide, what you've got, again, you start out with kind of a set of questions which get people looking at the info brief and absorbing some of that information, and then the bulk of session 3 in the discussion guide is a set of views, which get people kind of talking about this broader question of what kind of what general directions we might take to improve mental health among young people in particular. So that's kind of the key piece. I think then this next slide is actually the question, the way you kind of phrase this session and its overarching question in Sacramento, which is the kind of this question of how, where is it here? Discussion, yeah. What are the specific services that schools and communities should provide to more effectively address these needs? But in general, this session is the one where we're moving more toward giving people a chance to look at these options and to kind of start to visualize what they might want to see happening and what they might want to be planning for in their community.
So one of the important pieces that I continue to evolve on and learn about in these discussions is that there's sort of a story arc here, and it really comes together in session 3. And that is when you find the issues in mental health and how much we spend on treatment and recovery. The more that we can identify some of the signs and symptoms at an earlier age, and some of the interesting research, and it's in the information brief, is how some of these become before age 5, and certainly before age 14, nearly 3/4 of some of, and then before age 24, nearly 3/4 of all the mental health issues become pretty evident. And so to the extent that we can begin to identify early identification earlier, whether that be within families and schools and within like healthcare settings, a better chance that we're going to have at reducing treatment costs and the impacts to society. So the conversation, the story arc moves from how do we begin as a community or as a in a conversation to think about solutions that would identify these conditions earlier, that would be able to respond within the settings that work. Some of the interesting pieces that came out of Sacramento is many of the youth felt like they didn't have a safe place to go. You know, if you go down to a counselor or a psychologist, they're really looking for a place where mental health could be more normalized, and it would be just like going maybe to the school nurse or to a career vocational counselor, but finding ways for them to safely share what concerns are going on. And that's why the youth perspective in this one is so critical, to learn where they would go, how they might be able to share their concerns, and for teachers and for family members to begin to identify and recognize some of the signs and symptoms and what might be able to be done. So we distinguish between 2 age bands. In that previous slide, you'll see the conversations that we've been having, because they're a little bit different, focusing on youth ages 12 to 17, certainly within the K-12 system. And many schools have gone earlier and have done sort of social emotional development, mental health kind of developmental assessments that move into the earlier grades. But for purposes of youth in these conversations, we're focused on 12 to 17-year-olds, which are really within the school system, and then 18 to 24. And the reason that we've done that is not only for kind of identifying the different places that they might be. But the 18 to 24-year-olds are a little bit different situation, because once you turn 18, you're an adult, and you're all of a sudden in the adult mental health system. So many things change, and often what we call transition age youth fall through the cracks. And so there's more, this population is renowned for experimentation, for whether they have a job or not, and it's a real time of transition. So and where they're going to be in education world. So and another significant was just employment, the relationship that transition age youth have to getting a job, whether internships and educational opportunities. So for purpose of our conversation, if you look at our discussion guides, we've distinguished between those two and are generating recommendations based on those two age bands. So this conversation is primarily focused on youth, but obviously it has a direct relationship to all the way downstream through the adult system.
I just want to say, Tom, that as the parent of a teenager, to say that they are renowned for experimentation is a very complimentary way of putting it. Also, I don't know if people noticed, but the title of this session is rather peculiar, and I think it's an example of a situation where a lot of people are working together on something, and that they each shot down 57 different titles, and so we ended up with the rather academic-sounding Exploration of How to Respond as the title of Session 3. But there you go. So Session 4 is then, of course, focused more on action and getting people to be thinking about what they want to see happening in their community. And this is the one where I would imagine there's probably more need for adaptation according to what you're doing than perhaps any of the other sessions, because you may be in a situation where you've got you're facilitating something with 7 people, and you're just trying to figure out kind of what, if anything, people want to do and how they might support each other to do things, either to kind of get more people in the conversation or to kind of work on a particular action idea that they cooked up in the discussions or whatever. So you might be at that kind of level, or you might be, organizing something which is a really large-scale process where people are going to be working on a large-scale community plan like they were doing and are doing in Sacramento and Albuquerque. And so therefore, a lot of the conversation ought to be, okay, what should the elements be of this plan? What should the priorities be? And even within there, I know that between Sacramento and Albuquerque, I think the planning process was in different phases, and so therefore, and you can say more about this, Tom, but in Sacramento, I think they were reacting more to specific things that had already been put forward and saying, do you like these elements of a plan? Whereas in Albuquerque, I think where the planning process was just getting started, it was a more general, what are your main priorities for this issue that you think we ought to be planning for? So there's a lot of ways in which one could kind of again, adapt what's in the materials to kind of fit what you're doing. But in general, what you've got here in the discussion guide is, 4 people who are kind of focused on specific action steps that the group itself might take, that you've got that kind of relatively typical set of discussion questions, which people making commitments to one another and talking about what they want to do. And then a bit of things about kind of measurement. How would we know when we have succeeded doing these various pieces? Tom, do you want to say more?
Absolutely. There's so many different scales to which one might take this on. We're doing a very, in Sacramento, a county-wide one. In D.C., we're doing a district-wide one. It obviously can work from a small community conversation through a variety of different ways of looking at it. One of the things that it is significant, which Matt just mentioned, is that there's already a great deal of work that's being done. The mental health community has been very organized. There's advocates. There's certainly a very significant amount of effort that's been focused on this issue for many, many years. So then the question then comes up is, what can we add to this? What value can we provide by having this conversation going forward? And obviously that will relate to who the community is and who the client is and how you wanted to go forward. But and obviously these 4 sessions then relate to each other. So session 3 was identifying some things that we could do for youth, to the extent that you would be able to involve schools in taking some of these recommendations and finding ways to maybe perhaps create a safe place for kids to be able to share with their issues and get access to treatment, or whatever seems to come up out of the conversation. It can move in a lot of different directions. And while we were kind of focused on session 3 and how it relates to session 4, I think it's important to look at it more broadly, and I think in the information brief it does do that. But one of the things that came out for me in looking at how we did even session 1 and in session 2, the question about what are our attitudes and beliefs, the real importance of just even holding this conversation. We see some of our own prejudices. We see how we don't feel safe around people who might have a condition. We don't know exactly what to do. And just even holding the conversation, there's some really good resources like on mental health first aid. There's some great materials out there to understand how to respond to different situations. And just even holding those conversations and coming up with some ideas that you could further a conversation. And obviously with youth, social media is a big part of that. So it can certainly be a negative part of it, as we've found with some of the digital bullying and things that have happened that have led to some really recent suicides. But it also can be a way that youth get involved and really create a positive story. There's some good resources in Sacramento. There's a program called Stop Stigma Sacramento. The mentalhealth.gov has a piece now that the National Association of Broadcasters are doing about Let's Talk About It. There's a great deal of resources that people are developing just to even hold this conversation now that the president kicked this off, and you're seeing so many pins on the map where people really do see that there are some steps that can be taken, small or community-wide. So there's some key policy issues from federal, state, and local, all the way to what can we do in our neighborhood.
Awesome. So let me just say quickly, and please start queuing up your questions if you haven't already, but if you look at this kind of last slide we got here, just walk quickly through the planning guide, which is organized according to 7 different sections, one on setting goals, one on kind of deciding your format, one on recruiting participants, one on finding and training facilitators, then some of the event logistics to consider, and then planning for action and follow-up, and then some particular considerations for facilitators having to do particularly with kind of addressing mental health in particular and the ways in which people sometimes may respond that may be different from other kinds of issues. So it's got all kinds of information in there. You'll see, those of you who have done these kinds of things before, you'll see a lot of things that you recognize, maybe a few new pieces. Another resource that's going to be on the website on Monday, and it'll be one e-blast coming out that Raquel will be sending in the next few days. It is a kind of a quick start guide. So basically, what it is a cheat sheet that we developed with Sue McCormick's help, which gives people kind of a little simpler kind of step 1, do this, step 2, do that kind of thing, and points out particular pieces of the planning guide or parts of the website or things like that to kind of look for. So that's, I think, helpful, particularly for people who are, organizing something smaller. I mean, I think a lot of the information that's in the planning guide has to do with situations where you're really organizing, to get hundreds of people to the table and do action planning and all those kinds of things. So some of what's in this quick start guide that we'll be sending out is probably better suited for people who are kind of organizing smaller rounds or one-night forums or things like that. So please, if you do have questions about organizing, absolutely please ask them, but also at this point, please either raise your hand or type in to the chat box questions that you have, either about the materials.
I'm not seeing any questions come. Oh, here's one question from Michelle Holt-Shannon. Let's see. In telling people who participate where their input will go, can you describe the national plan for that? We will focus on a local and statewide effort ourselves, but we would like to be able to say concretely how information will get used.
Good question. And there's not a terribly lengthy answer to it. One thing that will be that we know and can talk about at length is the fact that on the map, that basically once people have organized their events, they can then kind of upload their results. And I think you see a couple of those already from, at least from the lead sites. So basically anybody, any federal policymaker, anybody at a federal agency will be able to click on any of these pins and find out what kinds of things people were talking about, what conclusions they drew, what action ideas that they're working on in those communities. There will, of course, also be a report, and we're starting to work, in fact, on an interim report to SAMHSA, to federal policymakers about kind of the kinds of things that people said. So there will be that kind of level of an input. And then we're also working on some other kind of organizing pieces. We haven't really unveiled them yet, but things that will kind of give people an additional way to kind of to be part of a national conversation. And so we'll be sending out more details about that stuff in the near future.
And if I could just add to that, and Tom, you may have additional things to say, but at some of the larger events, there are a set of polling questions and demographic information that we are collecting in a standardized format. That information is getting uploaded into our database, and researchers will actually have that information to be able to conduct various research on. And the researchers might vary in terms of who they are, but it's additional pieces that will be fed into the research component.
Yeah. Yet another thing, of course, is actually involving federal policymakers or state policymakers in the discussions themselves. And I think Michelle might be asking a bit of a leading question here, because I think that might be underway in New Hampshire, because, of course, that's another way to kind of involve the people who will, in fact, be able to do their job as elected officials, to be bringing some of these kinds of ideas and concerns to Washington or to the state capitol. Tom, was there, I mean, given also that Sacramento is the state capital of California, but was there kind of a connection like that there? Were there state officials present or federal? How did that happen in Sacramento?
Yeah, absolutely, and that was one of the great benefits. And I think the whole proposition of having these conversations and bringing together multiple conversations, we can start to see some of what the trends and needs are. But in Sacramento in particular, we had the state senator, Senator Darrell Steinberg, who is the leader of the state Senate, also was the author of Proposition 63, which created, it was a 1% tax on millionaires for mental health funding in 2006. He spoke, Congresswoman Doris Matsui, who mental health is a very strong issue for her in D.C., also spoke, and we had the mayor, and so we had a great lineup of people. So it's one thing to hold this conversation. Secondly, then what can you do with it? And so we're now digesting the work, the outcomes of the meeting, translating those into recommendations. For example, as I mentioned, the whole issue of student mental health, and how do we create a better system for that? Obviously, funding is a huge issue, but what are some of those best practices and ideas? We're taking those forward.
It will also be interesting to see, given that one of the next lead sites is in Washington, D.C., I think there will be a fair amount of participation from federal agency people there. And also, Secretary Sebelius will be coming to the session in Kansas City. Anyway, so I think increasingly we're getting more kind of direct participation from the administration in some of the lead sites in particular.
We have an additional question from Sydney Hankerson. I am planning a community conversation event, and I'm a psychiatric researcher. Have any of the previous events submitted Institutional Review Board or IRB protocols, and are there any plans to publish the objective of this program in scholarly journals?
Good question. Yeah, and I think yes on the first question, and I think in Arizona, Project Civil Discourse has gone through that process. I don't know for certain, but we can certainly find out about the IRB part of it. Yeah, we definitely. And then the second question is, I think we're very interested in having people publish various things about this in scholarly journals. All of the data is going to be available, both the ones data collected from the lead sites where there's keypad polling and things like that, and also other data that we can collect will be available to people, any researchers who want it, pre and post survey stuff, those kinds of things. So actually best thing is if you could actually contact me, and let's see if my email address, maybe I'll tab my email address in here. So I'm trying to keep track of the various different research aspects of this. And so, but the kind of the short answer is yes, and we want to make sure that we kind of seize this opportunity to get the most learning we can out of something that's, a rather unusual experiment in this kind of work.
And I'll send out Tom and Matt's contact email information in a follow-up email with the link to the video to today's webinar as well.
Awesome.
Okay, let me do one last check here. I don't see any other questions, and I see no hands raised. So if you do have other questions, do feel free when I send out that other email to ping Matt or Tom as well.
And organizing questions, please, as I said, feel free to contact any of us, but particularly Sue McCormick, and in particular to find other allies or people maybe in other parts of the country who are trying to do something of a similar format to yours or facing similar particular kind of subset issues of mental health that you might be. She can connect you with them, or other people in their area who are not necessarily kind of reflected on the map, but people that we may know kind of through our networks who could be helpful to what you're doing. So Sue, in fact, that's probably a good thing too, Raquel, if we could put Sue's email on that when we send around the resources as well. And then, of course, checking out Tom's materials on Sacramento with the link that he provided, and any of us, I guess, in terms of any questions you have or things that you're doing. If you do, yeah, go ahead.
We had one other question come in, which is a great one. It's from Sarah Lawton. Is there any resource that identifies organizations working on organizing forums, for instance, libraries or schools? Mm-hmm. And it would be nice to coordinate with people in the same field.
Absolutely. So there's a list on the website. Well, actually, there's two things. One, if there's an organization which is actually committed to organizing something, and if they put a pin on the map, then often you can find them that way. So that's one easy thing, either by clicking on pins near where you are, or clicking on other pins to find out, what the kind of the main organizers are. There's also, and then maybe actually, Raquel, you can say more about this, but there's also a page on the website which lists all the different national associations and networks which are helping to support this whole process. And so if you click on the American Libraries Association or the Association of Rural and State Libraries or some of those kinds of groups, I think you can find here the communities where these affiliates of these networks are working. So you can often find them that way. And again, this is somebody, if those two things don't work, or in addition to those two things, calling Sue McCormick and finding out from her is another way to do it.
Yeah, and I would just add to that we will be putting up some additional materials on our website in regard to it's called 3 Bold Steps Partner Plan Act program. And so that's something that it's a 3-step process that has been created for safe schools and healthy communities. And we actually just got the information today. And so you can follow up by checking out that resources tab. We'll post it under the resources tab, and it will probably be, I think we'll put it under sample outreach materials. So that will be another resource for you.
Awesome. And one last thing for me anyway, if you do adapt the materials or create an information sheet that goes along with them, or do create some type of new format or anything like that, we're also just curious to know about those things for the research purposes and also to help other people. So we're going to try to circulate, and we in fact already are circulating some of those kinds of locally produced materials to other people who are organizing things in other places. So make sure that if you're putting your brain power to use here, that we can perhaps then borrow it to help people in other places. Tom, you have any other last thoughts?
No, just good luck, everyone. I really think that this is a very timely conversation, and believe that the more we can broaden this conversation, the more action and greater impact we can have.
Awesome. Great. Thank you, Raquel.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
All right.
Thanks a lot.
Have a good day. Bye-bye.